Hopefully you guys can hear me. It's my first time streaming like live using OBS. It's pretty cool. So let's see, a little song I made a long time ago. All right, how do I see comments while you guys are talking to me? It's just like that, huh? All right. Let's see, can I pop this out? Pop out chat. Sweet. Okay, so I wanted to walk anybody who's interested through React Static, the client side of React Static. I've just been working on it recently for version 6, and the latest PR that I have open for React Static right now is called Go Routerless. And Go Routerless is my attempt to remove a lot of React Static's dependencies on a router. And so far, so great. It's been working pretty well in this branch, but there's a lot of changes that have come about because of it. And I'm going to go through some of them, but most notably is the out-of-the-box support for Reach Router. Now, just because this branch doesn't rely on a router does not mean that it doesn't support a router. I had a static JS. You know, and some people were like, whoa, like, don't get rid of the router. Said, hey, listen, React Router. So we've been using React Router a lot, and it's been built in, and we've been exporting their API. And it's like, no, I mean, we want to support all the routers, but I got some feedback here. No, don't create a third standard. Okay, I'm not going to create a third standard. I really appreciate what he said here. It's true. Death by choice, So I wanted to make it clear that we're not necessarily removing support for Reach Router or React Router in React Static. It's more internal. That's going to make it more reliable, and it also, because of that, helps us support multiple routers. So let's see. When we support multiple routers, like out of the box, I'm going to have it be Reach Router. So we're going to move all the examples over to Reach Router, which it really is not a lot. All you need in React Static to make it work really is a routing API that uses push state or replace state on the history. And as long as it's doing that, React Static is going to preload data correctly and load templates correctly. It's really neat. So let's see. So there's a lot of changes. I wanted to go overview really quick before I dive into the code. So since the last time React Static, you probably saw React Static, even in the V6 branch, all of this stuff was there, and now it's not. So we moved away from render and component props in all of our route data and site data components, because using a child as a function in React is pretty standard now, and I wanted to help standardize on that pattern. It just makes it easier to maintain and to show people how it works and not have 3 ways to do the same thing. So there's no more loading component, and that is because we're getting ready for Suspense. So React Suspense is going to be amazing, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Suspense because you can go watch many videos, other videos on React Suspense, how it works. Kent C. Dodds just made an awesome video at a meetup. I'm going to see if I can find that and link to it after this. So the other thing, obviously, I already talked about, is there's no more routing functionality internally in React Static. And we're going to just kind of rely on people importing React or Reach Router or React Router, depending if they want to do dynamic routes or not. Let's see, the prefetch when seen component. So I've decided, like, why not make it smart all the time? So now, anytime you use prefetch, it's just smart. If it comes into the viewport, it'll autoload, or it'll preload that asset. Let's see, redirects, that's minimal. Router, okay, so let's get into the code. So this is the basic example, and the basic example has a really simple static config. There's some site data which we may or may not even use in the example, but that's how you get site data. And then there's the get routes function right here, where we're just grabbing, you know, the top 100 posts from a JSON placeholder and using them as blog posts. So you'll notice that I don't have any routes here for pages like home and about. That's because now you can use a pages directory. So pages index actually maps to the home page and automatically creates a route for you. So this would be /blog, /about, /404, and all of these are just templates right out of the gate. And then the only one we really need to have any actual static routes for is the blog, because we have to feed the data to the blog. And you'll notice that I don't even put the component in here like it used to be. You know, this was like source, it'd be like components, blog, right? We don't even need to do that anymore because we already have a component for that under the blog page right here. So we're just attaching the data to that path. And then for the children, these are dynamically generated. Dynamic is like a loaded term. These are programmatically generated static pages, so we do have to provide the component. Otherwise, we'd have like a /post endpoint on our site that would bring up an empty template. But so we provide the path with the post ID and the component and get data. Yeah, it's pretty standard from all the other static stuff. So that's one main change. And then in our app right here, there are two changes. So you might have noticed that before you had to import routes from this special React static routes thing. I got asked so many times what that is. And they'd be like, is that an NPM module? I think I need to install it. And I'd be like, no, you don't need to install that. I actually published a package with that name that said, if you installed this, you should uninstall it. Because this was like a Webpack alias under the hood. And that confused a lot of people who were using it and who also were trying to help me maintain it. So now that's gone, and you actually can import routes right from React Static. And then before also, you probably noticed that this was a router. So before you had to import a router from React Static. Well, I don't want to call it router anymore because it's not. But it is the root of your project. And the deeper, or not the deeper, the shallow, how do I say that? The highest you can get your root component in your app, the better. It's what's providing a lot of the life cycles for handling things without a router. And I'm going to show you what root is comprised of soon, but for now, just know that it's taking care of React Static stuff. And then right here, like we're not exporting link from React Static anymore, so you can just do that from Reach Router. This is the router that we're going to recommend using out of the gate with React Static. And honestly, link is probably the only thing you'll ever need for most sites, most like marketing sites or simple blogs. And we prepare for that in root. There's a router already from Reach in root that helps set up things like base paths for links to make it so you can actually use relative links already. So these links work out of the gate. Don't pay attention to these squigglies. That's just an ESLint error that we haven't updated yet. And that's really all that has changed. So it looks a lot cleaner. And I'm going to show you how that works under the hood. So up to this point, this is very like end user. You know, if you are an end user and this looks interesting, if you're a developer and this looks interesting to you, React Static is really easy to set up a static site and make it feel basically like you're using Create React App. It's really easy, it's really fast, and it will probably make your life easier. So give it a try, you know. There's lots of other static site generators out there, and this is my favorite because I've been working on it and have a lot of other people who are now ready and willing to help me. And that's what this call is really about, because we're about to dive into the internals of how the client of React Static works. So hold on to your hats here. We're going to dive right in. So let's see. Okay, so this is the core of React Static. It is located in the packages directory under React Static. There's a source folder that has all of the goodies. And there's all of the static stuff that I went over in a previous video. I can link to that for you guys. All the static stuff goes over how the builds work, how Webpack works under the hood, how the routes and templates are generated. But once you get into the client, once you've loaded React Static, you know, I wanted to show you guys how that works. So since this is like kind of my first time streaming, I just wanted to double check here that I'm doing everything correctly. It goes over how the builds work, how Webpack works under. Okay. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm pretty sure they can. So, all right. So once you get into React Static Client, things get tricky, but that tricky stuff is really cool. So up to this point, in fact, I'm going to show you really quickly what the file system looks like at this point after we have done a build. So I'm in the basic example, and we are exporting to the dist directory inside of this project. So in the dist directory, there's a few things that you'll probably want to know about. So all of your bundles that we created get exported here. There's a main bundle, which is the main client bundle that's going to run, that's going to load as soon as possible when JavaScript loads on the React Static site. There's also occasionally a vendors bundle, depending on how you're doing your code splitting with Webpack. Out of the gate, we just kind of let Webpack do its normal optimizations. There's some source maps in here. Maybe if you've inserted some style sheets into your project, you might see some styles here. There's a static bundle here as well, which you'll notice is huge, but you do not need to worry about that. This static bundle is only used to generate the HTML pages in the CLI. So it's not actually running in the client. And it's bundled big, it runs fast, it's got a bunch of stuff externalized so it runs properly in Node. And then right here, you'll see that there are React Static templates here now. And actually, let's preview this file here. So this is a code-generated file, which means that this was generated in just plain text. And I'll actually show you where that gets generated. Generate templates. So like in this file, during the build process, we actually like form this file out of raw text. There's lots of ways to do code gen. I'm sure we could use some Babel macros, but this was just the simplest way that I could find. So using template strings to kind of build this together. But in production and development, the templates are different. In production, the templates are using universal. It's React Universal Component, or React Component Universal, I'm not sure. But Universal Component is really cool. It does automatic code splitting and lets us just pass like an import, which you can see in that file right here. So it's generating all these lines right here, and it's telling Webpack, hey, we're importing this asynchronously, so this is a separate chunk, and we're using universal, which basically wraps it up into a React component that we can preload and has a spinner and all this cool stuff. So we're generating this file so that the user doesn't have to repeat, so that you guys don't have to repeat all of the sitemap in your application code. You just do it once in static config and with your pages directory, and it kind of just builds all your routes right here. So once those templates are generated, the best place to start explaining all this would be in the Webpack prod. This is the production Webpack configuration, and there's a combo entry right here. So the first entry file that it calls for the client is bootstrap templates. Now, bootstrap templates is really simple, and this kind of helps us get around circular dependencies a little bit, but we're importing the templates from that generated templates file. So this is an array of templates. And then we are importing the register templates function from the React static client code, and we're registering those templates with the client with React static's core instance. So when we are in development mode, we also want to take care of hot module reloading. So there's a little hot module accept right here that accepts when any of the templates change, it re-registers the templates. So let's go to register templates. So, hey, that was like the first time I've used that definition drill through. That was really cool. So, let's see, register templates. So this index file right here in browser is the main, it's kind of like the main file of all the browser code. There's a lot of exported variables here, some like maps that we're going to use. They're all objects, and they're usually, you know, keyed on path. So this register templates function right here basically takes the templates that we have defined right here and splices in the new templates. And then it calls this template updated function. And this template updated function is mostly used for hot reloading in dev mode. Not, you know, templates aren't being reloaded or updated in production. They're being registered one time as these asynchronous imports. So this templates updated is really just for dev mode. And then throughout the course, throughout the life cycle of the app, we're keeping track of templates. So the templates are indexed by the template index on the route info. So every route info has a template index which says, hey, this is the template that I use to render. So we keep track of those. There's template index by path, and there's templates by path, which is the ending one. So really, in the end, you could say templates by path, and you could pass, you know, like about, and that would equal a universal component, right? And that universal component, like you can render that, and you can preload it. That's the React Universal Component API is right there. And we're loading those on demand. And that's really the whole point of this. I want to show you guys how all that works. So I'm sure we'll get to a lot of this as we use it. But there is an init function in the browser. This is the first thing that happens. Actually, let's make sure I'm not missing one more thing. oh yeah, there is a Bootstrap app entry, which this is so that we can take all of the static info that needs to be accessible in the app during the build stage, like during the node build stage where we're exporting the HTML. Since React context, the new React context, doesn't survive across Webpack builds, we just pass the static info in as like the default export is a function that takes static info and puts it onto the static info provider. And then we can use that static info throughout the entire app when we're doing static generation. Okay, then we hit this init function. This is where things start to get really cool. So you'll see a lot of this when React static environment equals development. So when we're in development mode, all this stuff is going to run right here. And this is how we listen for hot data changes. So this is really cool. So there's a difference between hot module reloading and hot data reloading. Hot module reloading, everybody's used to. You change one of your JavaScript files or an asset that's imported by Webpack, and it will just automatically reload just the bits and pieces of your app that have changed. But when you're consuming data from somewhere, right, you can't do that with the Webpack hot reloader or React hot loader, for example, because that's not Webpack. That's just asynchronous stuff. So like right here, we're using Axios, which is basically fetch, just better in my opinion. And we are using Axios to get all of our data throughout the life cycle of the app. And so it's not going to be subscribed to in dev mode like it is Webpack stuff. So what this does is this opens up a socket, which is just a little message bus between the browser and the CLI in dev mode. And so the CLI in dev mode is watching your config and watching your get data functions of your config. And anytime that those update or rerun or that you resave the config file, it's rerunning that. And then it's notifying it purges all of these things right here. It just says, you know what, we're going to get rid of our route info, our errors, our props. We're going to get rid of all that stuff that we've gotten from the client so far, and then we're going to re-request it. And that way, when you are in your, let's say you're in your blog post, right? And then you go and you add a new field in your static.config to your props over there, like get data for this post, you know, add a new field and you hit save. Then that post is going in the client, it's just going to re-request that data without reloading the page. So it's hot data reloading. It's really cool. It's not a new concept. It's used in a lot of places, but this is the socket that receives those messages. And you'll see this in the console. React static data hot loader WebSocket connected. Listening for data changes. And then, so that's only in development, okay? But all the time, in any circumstance, we always start the preloader. So the preloader is really cool. Before, in the old version of React Static, it would only preload links if you used React Static's link component. You know, you'd say link to about, and if this got rendered on the page, it would preload the about template and any data that it needed for the about page, right? That's cool, but then I was like, then you have to use the router that we export, and we're decorating all these routers all the time. And like, I didn't want to do that anymore. Decorating other people's components and then re-exporting them, it gets confusing, because then when link blows up, whose fault is it? Is it React Static's fault? Is it, you know, the user's fault? Or is it React Router's fault? Didn't want to deal with that anymore. So I was like, you know what? What if we just detected links on the page in general? Ahrefs, like go old school. And I was like, yeah, that's an awesome concept, so let's roll with it. Because anytime you're using React Router or Reach Router or whatever router, under the hood, it should be rendering an Ahref with the proper link to wherever you're headed, right? So right here, we set up a mutation observer, which this on mutation just comes from the utils mutation right here. All it's doing is watching the document and looking for insertions or changes to like ahref stuff, right? And anytime an element changes, it is going to let us know. And so just to be all-inclusive here, I didn't use the mutated elements because sometimes it's just a little more difficult to reason about, like, oh, is this getting all of the links on the page? So we do a query selector all for any a link component with an href. And then all of those hrefs, we put a visibility watcher on them, which the on visibility comes from utils visibility, which is another one that uses intersection observer, and now it's polyfilled. And in the case that, edge cases where things are moving because of animations and whatnot, it's polling but really slowly every second, which is not too bad. So when when one of those links becomes visible in your viewport, it prefetches that href. And this has worked out great. You can see, if I come into blog here, and open up the network panel, so all this is just looking for ahrefs. That's all it's doing. So if you'll notice when I reload the page, it's like, oh, I found these links on the page, and it preloaded all of their data. And then as we scroll down the page, you'll see it finds, oh, these ahref components are actually moving into the viewport, these elements. So it fetches them right there. You can see that again. If I start on the About page, it'll fetch for the blog because that has some route data. It fetches its own route info. But as soon as we move to blog, you'll see it fetch all of those ones. So this is local, so it's really fast, but it'll be similarly fast when it's actually deployed onto like a CDN. So that's what the preloader is doing right here. It's watching for changes on the DOM, it's watching for ahref elements, and it's just prefetching anything that it can see. And prefetch is graceful. So when prefetch gets a link that is not a static, it's not a static link. It doesn't belong to React Static, or it doesn't like it's an external link or something. Like, it's not going to try and prefetch Google. It's only prefetching the things that are inside of the React Static's responsibility. And it makes it easy to just kind of, hey, fire it off for this href. You don't really have to care if you know whether it is React Static's responsibility or not. Prefetch handles that. So that's how the preloader works. You might ask, what is prefetch doing? That is a perfect question that takes us to the next step. So prefetch right here, this prefetch function is a public API. It's exported, so you can actually do import prefetch from React Static. And you can use this. You can just prefetch like any link you want. And you can actually, let's see, data, yeah. So you can actually get the data from this prefetch. It returns a promise, so you can await it. And then you could have like the data from the About page if you wanted. But prefetch, what it does under the hood is takes a path. We get the route path. This is what's doing all that external cleaning. We detect the type. And then first, before we do anything, we want to make sure we're handling priority calls correctly. So priority happens, like, say we're preloading 100, say we're preloading like 100 pages, right? It doesn't preload them all at the same time because that would overload the network I/O. There's a pool, a worker pool that's working on these prefetch tasks, and if those are working and the user clicks on a link to go to a page, then we don't really care about that other prefetched stuff in the moment. We only care about the page they're going to. So we stop the worker pool temporarily. And if it is priority, we just fetch it right away. So the priority will get passed through options into these individual ones. But that's what this is doing, is it's saying, you know what, don't let the pool be running while we're doing priority calls. And then we detect the type. So you can, this is internal actually, it's not a public API anymore, but internally we can decide, do we only want to load the data for the path or the template for the path, or do we want to load both of them? And usually it's safe just to load both of them. This is kind of just an implementation detail, and I can't even remember why it's there. It might not need to be there. But for now, you can specify the type. Usually it just says, you know what, we need to prefetch the data and the template. And so this kicks off into separate functions right here. So we'll look at the data function first. So both prefetch data and prefetch template use the route info. So route info might look familiar. Route info comes from our static export. So if we go to blog, the blog export, there's the index.html page for the blog, and then there's this route info right here. This route info contains all of the stuff we need for the blog page. Let's format this really quick. No format. What if we save it? Prettier? No? Okay. That's weird. All right, bear with me. So you can see right here, this route info for the blog page has the template index, which is 2. Shared prop hashes, which it doesn't have any shared props inside it. And then it has local props, which has, so it's displaying all of the posts. So these are all of the posts, at least parts that we need for the blog page. So every time that we need to prefetch data, we need to know about those props. So we get the route info from the path. So get route info is a very generic function that's used in basically anything in React Static relies on this route info .json. So it takes a path and a priority, cleans the path like it always does. First, it will check if it's cached. If we've already requested it, then we just return it immediately. It's pretty much synchronous. Then we check to see if there was an error. Now, if there was an error, this either means that something is broken with the build, or it means that a route info was requested for something that isn't React Static's responsibility. And I think that's really the only 2 cases that it could be. It's either there was an error and it didn't work and something's wrong, or we already have the data. So if there was an error or non-existing route, then we don't return anything, and we let the render function just kind of throw an error, because if the route info is missing for a route that you need it on, that's a bad thing. Then if all is well up to this point, then we say, okay, we're going to go get the route info. In development mode, it's really easy. We just use this Webpack Express middleware, and we're just asking the CLI to give us the route info for this specific path. So the CLI will return the route info for the path from the last time it was updated, since the last time you saved your config.js. And then it puts it into this in-flight map right here. And this in-flight route info object is there because say you fire off 2 or 3 preloads for the same path. We don't want to be shooting off 3 different requests. Like, that's stupid. We want it to be sharing the same request. So we set this in-flight to use this path. and then we await that in flight. But we only do it if it doesn't exist. So if there's already a request going out for this route info, then it's just going to await that request right there and come back with the data. So that way there's only one call for every route info out at one time. And then in production, we do things a little differently. There's some, disable route prefixing, site route public path. This is all just to find the right endpoint to call, like the location of the, let's see, find the location of the route info.json file. That's all that's happening right here. There's a cache buster at the end as well. And then finally, we have the end all route info.json and location. So we check if it's priority. Now, if it is priority, we don't care about in-flight requests. In-flight also could mean that it's in the queue. So we can't really rely on in-flight for immediate stuff. So we just call it immediately if it's priority and get the route info back. If it's not priority, then we just add it to the queue. If it's already in the queue, then we just wait for it, just like we did up in the dev mode. But if it's not, then we add this task to the request pool. So this is just a function that returns a promise, and right now it's returning axios.getPath, and then we add that to the request pool. And then we await the in-flight route info path. And as soon as all that's done, it'll come back with route info, and hopefully come down here. Sometimes there will be an error. That's when we just mark the path as errored. We just say route error by path, give it the path, say true, and we will no longer request route info for that path because we know that either something is wrong or it's not our responsibility, like at 404. And then right here, if it wasn't priority, we need to delete the in-flight request, so it's not there anymore. Finally, we put the route info into the route info by path object, which is our global object up here. Route info by path. And then we return that route info. That's really some of the biggest logic to happen that gets the route info.json right there. And then, let's see, did I have a comment here? How does route info work with dynamic routes? That's a good question. So, dynamic routes, I think what you're talking about with dynamic routes is routes that aren't statically exported. So, if anywhere in your app you're using React Router, and say you have like route path equals admin, right? And then inside of here you're doing like admin stuff. Well, guess what? You don't really have access to static data in dynamic routes, and that's just because there's separation of concern there. If you wanted, I guess you could use prefetch to like prefetch certain route data, like static data, but the definition of a dynamic route is that it's not statically exported. So if you do need data in a dynamic route, something like admin, where it can't be built in the static build, it has to be live data. This is where, you'll come in and use whatever you want. Apollo, or you'll use, you can just request it. You could use React Suspense and use Axios to get the data. I mean, there's so many asynchronous data flows for React that you could use right here. That route won't be statically exported. So you can show loading components in there. You can have them wait to load it. It's completely fine. So route info doesn't really work with dynamic routes. If per se you were using route data inside of here, and you were expecting to be able to get route data for the admin path, well, route data is going to go try and find when you're inside of that route, it's going to go try and find admin.routeinfo.json, and that's not going to exist because admin is a dynamic route. It's a dynamic path. And when it finds out that that doesn't exist, it's actually going to throw an error because you're trying to access static data in a dynamic route. And that's not allowed right now unless you are, calling it like prefetch or something. But that's probably not a good idea. So I just had an email conversation with someone about this just yesterday. And basically, if you have data that needs to be live on your site, like up to date all the time, then you should be using dynamic data. You should be requesting that data when React mounts. And yeah, unfortunately, that stuff won't get statically exported, which I find to be not a huge problem because a minority of the use cases need live data. And when data is live like that, you can either rely on Google to run the JavaScript and see that information live, which is still hazy at this point, whether Google is doing that effectively or not. I know they do it to some extent, but that's not always true. And then that's also important to know, like if you need that data there statically for sure, then you should probably look into using something like Express or a server-side solution to be able to write that live data to the HTML that's being exported. But again, I think those are extreme use cases, and static sites cover so many of the majority use cases that I think there's ways around that. So rule of thumb, don't use route data in a dynamic route. It contradicts itself a little bit. So that was a great question. Thank you, Chandra. You're awesome. So let's see. Route path user ID component. Yep, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So if you have a user ID, route path user ID component. So, hey, if you know your users ahead of time at build time, then you could render user information at build time. But if it's a dashboard, needs to be interactive, like live interactive, again, that's not necessarily something you can just statically export because it's probably going to require that you protect that endpoint. You're not just going to be able to statically export sensitive user information into a dashboard. Yeah, it's just not, that's not the way it works right now. And probably it shouldn't be the way that it works, but route info and route data and site data, the React static components are for static data. If you want to use asynchronous data, then you can use anything else out there. You could just use the React state, component state. There is a situation where maybe you want to predefine some assets in your static site that you'll be able to fetch later, but that just seems like a pre-optimization to me at this point. If you want to have a more discussion about it, I would suggest you open an issue for it, but my guess is it's probably not going to land in the use case for like static export. Like static export uses static data, dynamic routes use dynamic data. That's just kind of how it is right now in the ecosystem. So getting back to this, there's prefetch data here that uses the route info. And then the route info, if it already has all of the props fetched, then we can just return it right away, as we know we have all of the data that we'll ever need. But if it doesn't have all of the props, if the all props is not set, then we need to kind of go get all of the props. Now, there's a difference in React Static between local props and shared props. Now, shared props are ones that are shared across all of the different like a bunch of different routes, and they're not included with every single route info. They're only in one file. And so right here, we go through the shared prop hashes, and we go and request those static data hash, those shared prop JSON files right there. And they sit in the root of your static site under static data with the hash. And that hash is kept in the route info. So if say a blog page needs a menu, some menu data that's used on a bunch of other pages, it'll go through and it'll try and find, it'll say, hey, is the menu stuff there? Do we have all the props? And it'll be like, no, we don't have the menu data. So it'll go through the shared props hashes and it'll find one for the menu, and it will go out and it will ask for that JSON file for the menu data. In development, let's see, in development, all props is always there. So we don't have to worry about doing shared prop stuff. But in production, there is a priority call, which we've seen before, which just bypasses the queue and says, go get this shared prop right here from static data. Otherwise, it uses in-flight prop hashes and a request pool, again, similar concept, to go get the shared prop data. Once it has it, it assigns it back to props by hash, and then the all props reassigns. So like it would be like all props menu equals, finally this data that it got. Like it, it'd be a bunch of data that you saved into that was saved into that JSON file because it was shared. So finally, all props get set right here, and now the route info is complete. We have the local props that were specific to the route. Then we have the shared props, which that it had in common with other route infos. And the cool thing about that is once a shared prop is requested once, it's cached. So if you have 5 blog posts that rely on the same menu data, it will only request that menu data one time. That's the whole point behind shared props. Kind of magical, a little magical part of it. There's a section in the static export that goes through and compares all those props to find the ones that are in common and put them out into shared files. It's really neat. So then you have all the route info and all the data is there. So we return, and that part of the prefetch is done for the data. Now, usually you're requesting the template at the same time. So the prefetch template function is very similar, gets the route info, and then if there's route info, we don't need to really request anything after that. We just need to know the template index for the route. And you might think like, oh, that's a really simple thing to know. Why not just like have that in the page or the HTML or something like that? Well, and when you have hundreds of thousands of routes, keeping track of which path maps to which template, that could be a very big JSON file or a very big something. Like, it's not something we want to embed. So it's not a pre-optimization, I promise. It is a large site optimization. We just need to get the route info to know which template index it is. And then we go and we get the template. So in development, this will just be an actual component. But in production, it will be that universal import component. So it grabs the template and it says, hey, if that template exists and it has the preload function, which universal templates do, then call the preload. If it's priority, then we need to call it right now. We need to preload that template immediately because we're probably trying to look at that page right now. If we're not, then we add it to the request pool and have the template preload there. Then we mark the route info with the template loaded as true, return the template. If there was an error, like if there wasn't a template found right here, or the template didn't have preload, we need to set an error on that template. So we have template error by path. We pass the path and we set it to true. So after that, you've prefetched all the data and you've prefetched the template. All of them are cached, and they cache early. They share requests. They go through worker pools so they don't overload the I/O. They're both using route info so they can share requests as much as possible. And then at the very end, if it was a priority call and we're done, then we can restart the request pool and return the data. That's what happens when you call prefetch in React Static, and it's called from a couple of different locations. Let's go into the routes component. So the routes component is what you render to show the static route that you're on. So if you go to /about on your website, this routes component is responsible for showing the template for /about. If you go to blog post 3, it's responsible for figuring out which template that should use to display, which is the post template, which is probably template index 2 or something like that. So under the hood, it's resolving which template to load and preload, and hopefully it's already preloaded because you had a link to it. But if it's not, then routes comes in. Let's see. Routes is kind of a cool thing. So usually you would need a router. Usually you'd think, okay, I need a router to watch for history changes and whatnot. Turns out it's actually really easy to watch the window for changes to the location. And I could have used the history library, or I could have imported from Reach Router, but I just wanted to keep it simple at first, so I built my own. So basically we override window on pop state and push then the history push state and history replace state functions right here. And all we're doing is we're not overriding them. We're just replacing them with proxies. So we have a little subscription set up right here. There's probably libraries to do this, but again, keeping it simple. So we have location subscribers, and anytime we trigger a change, it just loops through the subscribers and calls each function. There's an on-location change handler, which takes a callback, puts it into the subscribers, and returns an unsubscribe function, which just takes it out of the location subscribers. So anytime the window or whatever is, and we only do that when the document is available, by the way. We don't want to be doing that in Node. So anytime that the location bar changes, we are calling all of our location subscribers. So first things first, we are going to need the static info when we're doing static exporting, because we can't go request the route info.json file when we're statically exporting. So we provide that synchronously through React Context with this HOC. So here's the routes component. By default, there's a loader component that defaults to that spinner that you've seen in dev mode. But you can override that just by passing your own loader component. If we are in production, technically the routes component is ready to rock and roll. When it mounts, we are going to try and fetch the route info for whatever route that we're on. And we're also going to start tracking the location up above here, the window location. And when the window location changes, we want to force this routes component to update. So, and then when it unmounts, we kind of clean up that watcher. Then right here, when we're fetching route info, all we're doing is getting the current route path. And that could be whatever page you're on, like say it could be like about, or like from the window location, or it could be whatever static, like during the static export, whatever path is being exported. So it could also be about, it's just whatever path it is. Get current route path, whether that's in static or whether that is at runtime. If we're in development, that's really the only time that we're going to go get route info, like, let's see. Prefetch template. Some of this might need to be refactored. We're going to come back to that, this prefetch route info. But really the render function is where it's most important that we look at. So if we're in static export mode, we'll have static info here that we can use to get the current route path. Otherwise, we just get it from the window. And then there's this function here that gets the component for the path that we're on. Now, by default, we're just getting it for the current route path, but technically you can use a child as a function and use this get component for path to load whatever template you want really for any path. That's more an advanced feature, so I wouldn't worry about that right now. It's mostly used for animation. Right here, get component for path takes the route path, cleans it. We always clean it. You'll see that in a lot of places. And then we look for the component to see if it's already been loaded. And we also detect if it's the 404, component. And then we check for errors. So if there's an error, it means we tried to load the template for a React static route that doesn't exist. We never want to do that. If there is an error, then we need to show the 404 component. And this isn't totally fleshed out yet, but basically if it is 404, then we're just going to say use the 404 component, please. So right here we say, you know what, if the component is not loaded yet, we need to fire off a prefetch. And remember, we can prefetch as much as we want. So even though we're kind of illegally doing this in the render function, it's okay. It's just firing off prefetches to say, I need this template, please give it to me. And then when it gets done, we force an update to make sure that we can try again. And this is kind of where we start getting into the suspense model a little bit. Now, I know we're not using suspense here yet, but this is very suspensey. I'll explain in just a moment how. But after we've received this comp, whether it's the component, the actual template component, or whether it's 404, that's what we're going to render with all the props. And if it's not ready, then we're using the loader, you know, and we're also returning the loader component when we're waiting for it to load. So yeah, it is possible to see a loading component in React Static now, but that's okay. That's the worst case scenario. Like if you're in React Static and you think you're preloading a route, but you're not properly, or it's not there in time, and you go to a page, you don't want it to break like it was doing before. It's going to show a loading component, it's going to prioritize that call, and it's going to get there as soon as possible. And then it's going to render. So this is the coolest part. This is a model that is used throughout React Static now, whereas before we were trying to queue up these prefetches off of links and resolve all the data and templates before we even navigated to a certain page. But now we're treating it like Suspense treats it, or like it will treat it. When you go to a certain route, the route component is going to try and synchronously load this template. And when that template is not available, just like Suspense, we are kind of doing our own suspense right here. We fire off an async function. And yeah, right here, instead of using the resource and actually returning a resource and having the resource throw, like it would throw this, basically you could throw await. You could throw the promise right here. And React would suspend right here at this point. It would suspend, and anything above it, anything that's wrapping this component using like placeholder, and my knowledge of Suspense is still very young, so some of this might be wrong, but you know, if you're using a placeholder around the routes component, then it would show that placeholder. We're not ready for Suspense yet because everything's still being finalized. It's probably coming out very soon. So we're doing our own Suspense. We're just showing a loader that you can customize for now. But when Suspense comes out, it's going to be very easy to turn this request into a resource that React Suspense can use, which then gives you total control over how you want to display loaders or how you want to preload data using the React API. And that's really awesome that React Suspense is kind of giving the async control back to the user through like declaratively giving control back to the user. It's really amazing. So instead of right now, you can customize the loader component it uses, but in the future you'll just be able to use placeholder. You'll be able to use React Suspense, and it'll just kind of work out of the box. I'm really excited about it. This will be an easy change. I'll show you how route data is also very similar. So that's how the routes component works. Let's see, I think I updated some stuff in here, so we'll save that. Let's go to the other components. So there's the route data component, which is very similar to the routes component. Again, we're using with static info so that we can get any data from the static export that we need. There's another loader. Look at that. We won't need that again. We won't need that soon when Suspense comes out, but for now, we'll use it. And when route data mounts, it tries to load the route data, obviously. And loading the route data is pretty easy. All we do is fire off prefetch for the current route that we're on. And hopefully, and then after it gets done, we set state to loading false. So when the component loads, we fire off load data, right? So there's some asynchronous stuff happening. It becomes so much more powerful because we'll be able to bypass a lot of the life cycle dance that we used to do, setting loaders and setting state and stuff. Like we'll be able to just use synchronously render asynchronous assets. It's going to be really neat. So right here in the render function of route data, which let me show you the route data for the blog. So we're using the HOC version right here, but all it does is say with route data, and it's just a child as a function that gives us the route data that we passed in our static.config. So this would be the post. So it would be this object right here, and that's what we want to get in our blog, all the posts, and then we map over them to create that big list. So when it renders, first thing it's going to do is get whatever route it's on. If it's statically exported, then it's going to use a static route. Otherwise, it's going to get it from the window. And then right here, we say, you know what, if there was an error, if we detected an error trying to get this route info or this route data, then we need to throw. We used to just warn right here. Let's see, is your talk from a Utah JS meetup still online somewhere where you talk about how React Static works on the site you made it on? Yeah, it is. I believe it is. If it's not, I will send you a link. So I used to just warn about this, like, hey, you're using route data where you shouldn't be using route data. That's kind of a stupid warning. That was like, hey, you might be doing something wrong, but I can't really tell you what you're doing wrong. That was the dumbest warning ever. Well, we got rid of it now because guess what? You're not allowed to use route data on dynamic routes anyway. So if you're trying to access route data in a place where React Static doesn't have control or there is no route data, you want an error. You want to know that you're doing something wrong and you want to know how to fix it. So it says, hey, route data could not find any data for this route. If it's dynamic, remove any reliance on route data or with route data from this routes component. It's a really simple fix. Don't try to use static data in a dynamic place. If you need static data, then provide it in your static.config to the route that needs it. That's really all it is. So it's positive reinforcement here. So if there wasn't an error, then we're going to go check to see if we have the route info by path. If there isn't the route info at all, like if we haven't even requested the route info, then we show the loader. If we have requested the route info, but all props is not there yet, then we show the loader, because this means that we're loading shared props at this point. Finally, we'll check and see, hey, you know what, is the route info by path finally there? Well, actually, we know that if we get past this point, it will always be there. So technically, we don't even need that. So we can just return that. So it then returns children with all props. That's really easy. And that's how you magically get this post right here. Man, I love how simple that is. So similarly, right here, you can see we're not doing it the synchronous, like the synchronous fetching way that I was doing in the routes component. We very well could. All we're doing right here is component did update, and this right here, this is the life cycle dance that I was talking about. Without React Suspense, this is the dance you do. You hook something up on render or component did update, and you're like watching for something to change, right? In this case, we're looking for, like, we're keeping track of the path we're on versus the path we were on, and we're comparing them. We'll be like, hey, did we just change like locations? Did the location bar change? Because if it did, we need to try and reload the route data again. I hate doing this dance. And it's going to be so nice because pretty soon this logic right here is going to be able to come down into render in a resource of sorts. And basically I'm going to be able to say, you know what, just give me the route data. I'll be like, resource, give me the route data for this current path. And if that resource hasn't resolved yet, then it's going to throw a promise. And async React is going to show spinners and suspend that fiber. And, you know, I can show my own spinners if I want. And then next time it comes around, when that promise resolves, it's going to re-render and it's going to have, like, it'll have route info right here. So I won't even need that life cycle. I won't even need to fire anything off. It's just a promise that resolves. So I can have it go do whatever I want. Again, I cannot wait for that. It's going to be so nice. But for now, I have to do the life cycle dance. And let's be honest, the life cycle dance is still not that bad compared to what we used to have to do for data before React. Man, React just makes things so simple. So there it is, like getting route info and getting the props from it. It's really easy. A lot of this stuff just relies on that prefetch call. It's just like, hey, prefetch the stuff. Oh, and you might have noticed this right here. This is something new in v6. So when you do show a spinner, I know in Suspense this is going to be a lot easier to handle, but like in Suspense, you can set minimum times to show spinners, or say, you know what, don't show anything until like 200 milliseconds and then show a spinner. Well, we don't have all that control right now. We could build it, but it'd be kind of useless with Suspense coming out so soon. So instead, there's this new option called min load time. It's in your static.config. You can say min load time. It's like in your config, you can do min load time. And set it to like 200 or something, 200 milliseconds. But basically it says there's a minimum, if something isn't ready, if an asset is not ready in React Static, there's a minimum load time to show the spinner. Because when you see a spinner for, you know, 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, like, it's really jarring. It's just as jarring as a flash of unstyled content. And so in this case, we set the min load time to 200 milliseconds by default. So if you do have to load something, the spinner shows for 200 milliseconds, which I feel is a fine time. You can change it if you want. But it's kind of like, oh, something was loading. Oh, okay, it's done. Instead of being like, flash, flash. And you're like, what the freak was that? you know, it's, again, suspense to the rescue. It's going to be so nice. So that's route info. There's the HOC right there that just uses the same route info component that you could use. So let's save that. I'm going to take you to site, or sorry, that's the route data component with route data HOC. Here's the site data component, which is so similar, but you know, with site info, this is all kind of the same stuff we've seen. And what's great is site info is embedded in every page. So we never really have to like asynchronously request that, because site info gets passed to every single page regardless. So it's always there. In fact, it's under the hood, it's hanging out on route info, site info. So we can access that synchronously, and that's exactly what we do here. So if we're in dev mode, it's not there synchronously, so we just request site data right here. Not a big deal. Again, there's a loader, but really you'll only ever see that in dev mode. So I don't know why you can customize that. Again, something that's going to disappear with Suspense. It's going to be really nice. So let's see, there's those two components that you probably use the most. Let's see, site data, routes, route data. See how many components are left now after you get rid of all the routing specific stuff. The components, they're so far and few between now with React Static. There's only a few that run everything. I'm going to go to the root very last. We kept the hash scroller around. If you don't know what the hash scroller is, it's what looks for the hashes in your URLs and smooth scrolls you to the location. And also, if you change locations, like if you're changing routes, it scrolls you to the top of the page. You can disable it pretty easy. There's some options that you can use to customize it if you want, but we kept it around. And we're still using location from reach router. That's probably going to change. There's an error boundary that we're using still in React Static. Let's see. Yeah, so this is actually a really simple error boundary that just says, you know what, if a component catches in this error boundary, we show the error, we show the stack. There's also a reload component button that's kind of nice. So it's like if you fix it in hot reloading or fix it in data or something like that, you don't have to reload. You can just hit this button and it will just try and render again. Kind of fun. Little tidbit. You'd actually use this in your own apps. It's really, really simple. I use this in Nozzle all the time, so that if an endpoint is broken or my internet was off or something like that, I can turn my internet back on or fix the endpoint and then just hit this reload component button, and it will re-request or whatever. It's really kind of fun. So let's see, one of the last components I need to show you, there's a prefetch component, which is just same as ever. You can use prefetch, pass a path like about, and then when you render when you render that component, like you can put anything you want inside it. But when this renders on the page, visibly renders on the page, it will prefetch that. So if you need to do like custom prefetching, you can use prefetch. Okay, so the root component, boom. This is probably the one that changed the most, but it's also, I hope, is like the least important. So we'd probably, disregard that for now. But right now, how the root component works is it acts just like the router used to. It gives context to React Static. It's passing context down through some things, I think, maybe not. This is where the hash scroller lives inside of the root. It's also where the error boundary lives. The error boundary lives inside of the root as well. In fact, let's just go look at the render function for it. So the error boundary lives at the top of the root component, so it's the very first thing that gets rendered. And then we have this wrapper thing right here, which we'll find out what the wrapper does here in a second. So right here, this is using a render prop, which is an advanced feature, but we're not, I'll cover that at the very end. But by default, it inserts a default, by default, it uses a default router at the root. And I know that we said, React Static doesn't include a router, but I think it should include at least support for reach router. And when I say support, I just mean that I don't want people to have to handle setting up their own base router for reach. And that's because, especially when you can have a base path in React Static. So say your site is https nozzle.io/blog. And let's say this is an entire site inside of blog. So nozzle.io is its own site, but then blog is its own static site. So blog would be a base path right here. And so this would kind of be like the root of your site, per se, if you can imagine that. It's pretty common. And in all of the React routers that you can use, you can set a base path. Like in React Router, you can do router base path, and set the base path to something like blog or whatever. And what that does is it makes it so that any link you use inside of it, when you do a link and you say this is going to post 2 or post 3, that's actually going to render an ahref that looks like this. It's going to be blog/post3, and that's what the base path does. And it also makes sure that it's not using /blog from the URL in your links and in your dynamic routing. So that's most of the reason why we do this right here. You can see we're including the hash scroller as long as it's not disabled. But the default router is really nothing special. There is the reach router right here, which gets whatever props you send to it. Then there's a default path because we don't need to detect any routes right here, but we're at least providing the base path to reach router through these props. And then we just send the default path through right here, and this default path is just a component that renders whatever we give in the render. It's just a way to make reach router not freak out that we're just passing a single default path. So that's the default router that comes with it, and really all it is, really all it does is sets up base path functionality for reach router. And I want everybody to use reach router. I think it's amazing. I think the accessibility features it has are amazing, that it's making those a lot better. And I also think that the routing API is so much easier to use. I get really excited about the relative linking. You can do relative links in reach router. So that lets you do truly isolated routing in your apps. So you can build micro features, micro apps inside of your application that use routing and move them around wherever you want and not have to worry about. You can just put a new router in there and it's all relative. It's really neat. Reach router is just so good in so many ways, and so that's why I want to push people to use it, and that's why I'm including support for it out of the box. So really, this child as a function render comes down to if you want to use your own router. And if you wanted to use your own router, you could easily do this. You call root with the child as a function, and it's going to get render props. And render props is passing base path and whatever the rest of the props were that were passed to root, which that doesn't make it a ton of sense right there, I guess. But I mean, it's not hurting anything, but it might be unnecessary. So really, base path is what you're looking for. And then right here, you can just render your own router. So if we wanted to use React Router, you could put router base path equals base path. And now you can just import link from React Router if you want. React Router DOM, you could use, and then you want to import your router right here. So yeah, it's really easy to swap out like that small support for reach router that's built into React Static. You can easily be swapped out. But kind of an advanced use case, I really don't think a lot of people are going to go back to using React Router DOM. I'd rather have them just use reach router. You really will be grateful that you use it. So, you know, and I gotta note that using that advanced, like bringing your own router in, can be complicated. You need to make sure that you're not trying to render a browser router when you're in the node context. And there's a little bit in the documentation of React Static about writing node safe code. Anything you do in your app has to be node safe, meaning that it doesn't try and utilize anything on the window or rely on the DOM during a static export. So that is, yeah, that's the root component. Really, it doesn't totally do a lot. And that's the beauty of it, is before the router component that sat at the root was doing a ton of stuff. It was monkey patching, you know, window location history objects, and it was subscribing to a billion things, and you know, just assumed that you were using React Router. And it's really nice just to be free of that. So I just took you through all of the components of React Static. Let's see, root, route data, route, site data, spinner. Oh, if you wanted to see the spinner, it's just some SVG. Which you can override and replace anytime you want. I guess I should go over the utilities really quick. There's this visibility utility, which just uses intersection observer. It's polyfilled. There's a mutation utility, mutation observer in Node, so that's why we check for the document. We're still using the scroll to utility to do hash scrolling in the hash scroller. And then there's just a bunch of utilities right here that we use in the browser. And some of these are used in the static portion of like the CLI as well. But we put them in the browser here just so that we know that they are browser safe utilities. So you know, things like checking for is SSR and whatnot. And yeah, one thing you can notice that you might have noticed isn't in here yet in the browser portion of the code are plugins. And plugins are going to be great for v6. If you look right here next to the static or the generated React Static templates file, next to it there is a React Static browser plugins file, which is loading all of the browser plugins and code genning them into this file that we can import. So we will have access to these plugins inside of the browser portion of React Static. And we don't have any in there yet, but it's really easy. It's going to be really easy to basically just import, you know, plugins from, actually we're in the index file, so the plugins will be in here. We will be exporting plugins inside of here. I don't think we have any plugins in here yet, but there'll be a section in here with plugins, and we'll be exporting const plugins. And those plugins will get loaded in at bootstrap time, and we'll be able to kind of go through and run plugin lifecycles. That's really where I need a lot of you guys' help, is just cleaning up all this code, making sure that it works well on the client. It's a lot simpler than it used to be. I feel really good about it, and I can't wait to see what people are able to do with it. I'm really proud of the simplicity of it. I feel like with other systems like Next and Gatsby, that, you know, trying to dig into the source code can be extremely overwhelming because everything's using message buses and events and whatnot. And I really wanted React Static to embrace as much top-down data as much immutability as possible, and just kind of good old JavaScript, import, export, like nothing fancy. You can see that it's just a bunch of variables and functions running with some React components. So I hope that this has been a good overview of the overview. It's not an overview. I hope this has been a great in-depth session of the React Static Client. Things are definitely going to evolve and change, but I'm so excited about where the client is headed. We still have a lot of work to do with plugins and with service workers and more intelligent prefetching. You know, there's some really interesting things going on out there with using Google Analytics to prefetch based on where they think the user's going, and just making React Static the fastest static site generator out there. There's no reason why I wouldn't use React Static for basically any React project I have going forward. Heck, I even use it for my non-static projects, and I just export one route, which is index.html, the base route, because it's got an amazing build system. It's got a plugin system, and I don't, you know, it's like using Create React App, but I can modify the Webpack plugin or modify the Webpack configuration and do a lot of cool, tricky things with the build system that doesn't break future updates. So if you guys have any questions, be sure to make an issue on the GitHub repo for React Static. You could leave a comment on this video if you want. Please don't email me, but if you'd like to become a contributor, there's a contributor issue on GitHub that you can come and comment on. Let's see. Maintainers and contributors. If you leave your message here, give me your email, or just find a way to give me your email address, I can invite you to our private contributor Slack organization, where we have super secret, in-depth discussions about React Static. No, not really. We just talk about really fun things and development things and how we can make it better. So I hope you guys had a good time. This is my first time really live streaming with an audience, so I hope I didn't totally or royally screw it up. And yeah, have a great time. Have a good day. I'm going to go and work on React Static. Thanks.